Imagine an arduous and lengthy journey which is undertaken by a single person with the simple but crucial goal of reaching someone they love. Each step in the journey is riddled with complications and compromise and forms a struggle that will drive that person to question who they are and why they continue to endure such hardship given the likelihood of never reaching that destination anyway. Though this could easily describe my experience of the Cambridgeshire public transport system, I refer in this case to the rough premise of Always Sometimes Monsters, a dialogue-driven adventure RPG from Vagabond Dog and published by Devolver Digital. Upon selecting a character and a love interest from a diverse range of avatars, the player is confronted almost immediately with the predicament from which the rest of the narrative of the game unfolds. Having strived to attain the lifestyle and career of their dreams with an initial jubilant optimism, the protagonist is found to be well in the process of falling short of their goal and also, to their lament, single. Reading this as I've typed it, it dawns on me that this could equally be the insipid third act of an unremarkably god-awful romantic comedy, but I can assure you this really wasn't how the plot was delivered, and it's certainly not the direction it took as it developed. What Always Sometimes Monsters instead offers the player is an overarching goal, but also enough time and enough freedom of choice for the player to build their character and their opinions of NPCs as well, through various encounters and experiences, many of which are non-essential. Each day within the game tends to feel like its own mission, and a new struggle for the protagonist. Although the player is granted a fair degree of freedom at most points, typically there's a struggle to find the time to do everything you want within a day, and diversions can end up costing you. Incidentally, I can shamefully admit to being willfully distracted by shallow metagames rather than visiting an ailing digital friend in a hospital. They were fine though, in the end. To return to the point, what the game challenges the player to do from the start is essentially to improve that character, to give them an ideal life or achieve an ultimate personal victory. Gameplay is propped up heavily by text-based dialogue, and Vagabond Dog make little effort to skirt around the issues the player is forced to face, though quite skillfully tailor them to choices the player has made, and also at times to their character's race, gender, and sexual orientation. The player is encouraged to think, challenged to justify themselves on fairly personal principles at times. I was surprised by the game's capacity for unsettling the player when I reached the point where in-game discussion began to relate to my own personal insecurities, but then the developers themselves have stated their design of making games based on real experiences, and so maybe discomfort should be anticipated. Not an invasive one, but again something for the player to chew on. Failure is incorporated as an eventuality as well. There are numerous occasions on which the player can end the game having failed to rescue their career or love life, and the game has contingencies for failing to accomplish objectives throughout, which is kind of refreshing and bleak at the same time, considering that disappointment is a constant factor in real life, but usually reserved only for franchise reboots as far as video games are concerned. For some time the game continues in this fashion, building a portfolio of characteristics through flashbacks, dilemmas, and a fair degree of humour. The delivery isn't immaculate, certainly the mixed tone of the game could draw some criticism. At times, Always Sometimes Monsters becomes the kind of soap opera that the title implies, and at others it becomes a sitcom, but it seems almost inexorable that a game that attempts to encapsulate the trials and inevitabilities of life whilst also entertaining the player would make use of cheap laughs and heavy dramatization from time to time. Perhaps the more reasonable complaint would be that the game is at times exorbitantly self-referential. No doubt a mark of the personal pride taken in this game by the developers, but also something that ends up detaching the player from an otherwise absorbing experience. In any case, the writing, narrative, and storyline are areas in which this game is abundantly strong. The limitations that Always Sometimes Monsters does possess tend to fall mainly, though not exclusively, within the gameplay. There are mechanics that don't especially work that were probably added to give the more active parts of the game some extra depth, such as the stamina bar. If your character attempts to sleep with an empty stamina bar, it's foreshadowed that there will be undesirable consequences the following day. Food of any kind will fill the bar to wildly varying extents. For example, it would probably take somewhere in the region of an entire Women's Institute meeting's worth of sandwiches to attain an entirely full stamina bar, but you could probably last for 3 days off a single raw fish. A dependency on food does add a touch of realism to a game that tries to be relatively grounded, but the system employed to attain it is too inconsistent to make it really worth having in the game, beyond keeping a limit on the character's funds. Later on in the game, there's a mandatory spell of gameplay set in a boxing club, and although it forms one of the more lively sections of the game, it incorporates elements of tediousness, randomness, and repetition that make it reminiscent of the core features of Gods Will Be Watching. Fortunately, it doesn't really stray into that territory beyond the aforementioned segment, and again, this forms a genuine attempt at adding depth to the gameplay that doesn't quite work out. Besides that, there are some elements that are deliberately intended to be boring, such as manual labour, which on the one hand does generate some additional empathy for the character, but on the other somewhat dulls the enjoyment. It can sometimes be hard to keep track of all the more important story elements while still taking advantage of the freedom on offer as well, given that there isn't really a way of reminding yourself in-game about what you're supposed to be doing. After that, the issues became rather more technical. This game rejected both fraps and dexterity as recording options, which isn't ideal. There's some fairly regular screen tearing when your character is walking around an environment, and enabling VSync doesn't really fix it. Then there's the general RPG Maker issue of not accommodating for my native resolution, which is 1920 by 1080, which again doesn't lend itself to making good YouTube videos for a start. However, I most certainly did appreciate the diverse and evocative original soundtrack, courtesy of Laser Destroyer Team. I never really cared much for synth before now, but that soundtrack is something I wasn't really able to let go after finishing my time with the game. Anyway, Always Sometimes Monsters culminates in the player's gradual realization that their character is hanging by a thread, and it's going to be difficult for them to achieve anything without some degree of sacrifice, without hurting another character in the process, whether inadvertently or otherwise. The introspection then goes further. What outcome are you looking for exactly? Why do you want this to happen? Will it really make you happy? Finally, the game's title, which had hitherto been on shaky ground as far as I was concerned, falls into place with a relatively protracted plot that seemed to be running out of steam until the final act of the game. The character is asked whether they deserve whatever it is they're after, when it will almost unavoidably come at the expense of someone else. By this stage in the game, it's probable that your character has done something morally questionable to get where they are, even if it didn't seem that way at the time. Ultimately, the final choices the player makes are framed by the game's persistent argument that not everyone can have everything they want, and by the usually subtextual question of whether the player deserves what they want more than someone else. It's not an especially optimistic overview, and its implied consequence is arguably somewhat exaggerated, but where games like To the Moon innocuously exploit the player's empathy, Always Sometimes Monsters challenges the player's rationalization of what they deserve and how they treat other people, and for a game that entertains throughout, I find that commendable. I mean, in the end, aren't we always sometimes monsters? No, I can't say that.